So today we're concluding our vision teaching series that we do. We do a vision teaching series at some point throughout the year. This year we're doing it right here at the beginning. And it's called Every Square Inch. And it's all about how Jesus is Lord over every area of your life. And we get the phrase every square inch inspired by a 19th century Dutch theologian named Abraham Kuyper. And this is the last time I'm going to share this quote with you. But then you're going to start noticing it all. It's going to pop up all over your life. You'll hear it for the rest of your life in different ways. But this is what it says. It says, it's not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is Lord over all, does not exclaim mine. We've talked about how that means every minute, every dollar, every person, every word, and even more than that, leading up to this week, where we're going to talk about every inch, and we're going to take it quite literally. And today is Vision Sunday. It's a Sunday where you're invited into where we sense God leading us in the next year. And as I'm going to share more about in this sermon, we are taking every square inch very literally. And so let's dive into our teaching text for today. You can grab a Bible in front of you. You can open up the Bible on your phone, Matthew chapter 25, 14 through 30. If you've never opened a Bible before, this is a great chance to open one and find your way around it. There's a table of contents in the front of every Bible. It's broken down into the Old Testament and the New Testament. So Old Testament is leading up to the birth of Jesus. New Testament is birth of Jesus in response. Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. So we're in Matthew chapter 25, big numbers, small numbers, 14 through 30. That's where we're at. And I'm going to read the whole teaching text for us today. And so you can follow along in your Bible or on the screen, and then we're going to spend the rest of our sermon unpacking and thinking about what does this mean for where God might be leading our church in this next season. So Matthew chapter 25, 14 through 30 says this, "For it is just like a man to go on a journey. He called his own servants and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2 talents, to another 1 talent, depending on each one's ability. Then he went on a journey. Immediately, the man who had received 5 talents went, put them to work, earned 5 more. In the same way, the man with 2 earned 2 more. But the man who had received 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 talents approached, presented 5 more talents, and said, 'Master, you gave me 5 talents. See, I earned 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Share your master's joy.' The man with 2 talents also approached, and he said, 'Master, you gave me 2 talents. See, I've earned 2 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Share your master's joy.' The man who had received 1 talent also approached and said, 'Master, I know you. You're a harsh man, reaping where you haven't sown, gathering where you haven't scattered seed. So I was afraid, and I went off, and I hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours.' His master replied to him, 'You evil, lazy servant. If you knew that I reap where I haven't sown and gather where I haven't scattered, then you should have deposited my money with the bankers, and I would have received my money back with interest when I returned. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have more than enough. But from the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. And throw this good-for-nothing servant into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Happy Vision Sunday, everyone. I promise we're going to come back to that, and we'll get there. But Matthew 25, 14 through 30 is one of Jesus' most famous parables. And if you know anything about Jesus, you know that his preferred teaching style was not just what you think of as lecturing today, but he often taught in stories. And he was a master storyteller. He would tell stories all over the place, taking things from everyday life and giving them new and fresh meaning that could help people understand things about the kingdom of God, or what we like to say, the life that you're made for. And commonly, he would teach these parables, which would take things from everyday life that people knew and help them understand what life in the kingdom was all about. And not every detail in a parable can be pressed for meaning, and not every detail always has some significance, but Jesus was particular with his choice of words. And often when you pay attention to the opening of a parable, you get a couple of details that can help you make sense of the rest of the parable and what you're supposed to do with it. So let's go back to the first line of this one and just unpack this line a little bit, and then we're going to dive in a little further. It says this, "For it was just like a man about to go on a journey. He called his servants and entrusted his possessions to them." Matthew chapter 25, verse 14. And so the parable opens with a man who has many possessions. And in this parable, it's clearly intended to be the person who is teaching the parable, Jesus, who is God himself in the flesh. Jesus, our God in the flesh, is the one who owns or possesses everything. He's the one who, as we've been sharing in that quote from the beginning, who can rightfully say mine over everything on earth. Like all these things actually belong to him. Like we think they're ours, but they're actually his possessions that we have been entrusted with. And then we find out that this person is about to go on a long journey in which he's going to be gone for some time until he returns. And in light of what happens in the rest of the gospel, if you read through the next few chapters of Matthew, you're going to see what he means by this, where at the end of the gospel of Matthew, he's crucified. 3 days later, he rises from the dead. And then 40 days after that, he ascends to the right hand of the Father, and he's been there ever since. And one day, he promises that he'll return, and he gives us his Holy Spirit in the meantime. And so this is what's happening here. When he's talking about this long journey, he's talking about the time in between Jesus' departure and his return, which is where we are right now. We're in between his departure almost 2,000 years ago, where he's now seated at the right hand of the Father, and his return when he returns in glory, as we already just sang about a little bit ago. And so with that, he has different servants. In the meantime, while he's away on this journey, he has these different servants. And if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, this is where you're at in this parable, where you're invited to see this is where you fit. And these are people who are living under the lordship of Jesus. We talked about this a few weeks ago, and we talked about every person. And then while he's away, it says he's entrusted his possessions to his servants. And in the story, he uses the illustration of a particular possession. He talks about money. We talked about how Jesus would use every dollar a couple of weeks ago. But he uses money as an illustration of the kinds of possessions that he's leaving with his servants. And in the first century world of Jesus, he uses the word talent to talk about money. And so if you're unfamiliar with first century to 21st century foreign exchange rates, let me just give you a glimpse of what commentaries say. Basically, a talent is 6,000 denarii, or about 20 years of minimum wage for a day laborer. And so he doesn't give the same amount to everybody. To one servant, he gives 5 talents. To another servant, he gives 2. And then to the last servant, he gives 1. And he just says, he divvies it up. Those are the details that set up the rest of the parable. But what I want us to do is read this a little bit different than you might be used to reading this story. I want to invite you to read this parable in light of where we're headed this year. Still well within the interpretive boundaries of what can be true and how you can apply this parable. But I want us to read this a little bit differently than we might normally read it in your personal Bible study. So first of all, when you normally read this story, you're just reading along and you see this story, you would probably normally think of servants, when you read the story, as different individuals. Maybe you, the person sitting next to you, somebody else in your life, the people that sit next to you at church, whatever it is. And that's a good way to interpret and apply this story, that there's different servants who could represent different individuals and who are responsible for different things. And that's a fair way to read it, because at the end of the day, we are going to be individually responsible for what did we do with what Jesus has entrusted to us. But another way that I think we can read this, applying the same principle, is instead of just reading the servants as individuals, an invitation for you today is to read it as churches. Not just one person in a church, but as whole churches together, like this one right here, like Bellevue Christian Church. What if we thought of the servants in this story as different churches? One of them being Bellevue Christian Church, maybe another one being Northway, another one being Bridge City, or Redeemer, who we're partnering with, or Renaissance, where my friend Rob is the pastor, or any number of churches in our city. And we thought of these different servants here as different churches that have been entrusted with something by Jesus. And then also when you normally read this story, the first thing that you tend to think about that he's entrusting people with is money. And I've heard many sermons over the course of my life where this text has been preached to talk about money. And we talked about money a couple of weeks ago a little bit and how all of that belongs to Jesus too, but that's not how we're going to read it today. But it makes sense to talk about money because Jesus himself says when he's handing out these possessions to people, the illustration of possessions is talents or money. But at the same time, this principle has been taken and applied in other ways. So for example, you'll often hear a church apply it this way, where you have this principle of what has Jesus given? He's given out his possessions, what rightfully belongs to him, to others. You know, I've heard it preached like, hey, God has given you literal talents, literal things that you're good at that you can use for God's kingdom. And so there's a lot of ways you can take this principle beyond just money and apply it to things. And what I want us to think about today is, what if we also thought about possessions that he's handing out and entrusting to these different servants, or in this case, churches? What if we thought about possessions as also including things like property that God has given? Every square foot or square inch. Instead of handing out 5 talents, 5 acres, or 2 acres or 1 acre. And different churches have been entrusted with different amounts of property and financial resources, some more than others, some less. And in the end, it's not about how much or how little they have. It's just about what are they going to do with it, regardless of how much they have. I brought my Stanley PowerLock 25-foot tape measure today. If you've been wondering why I've been carrying this around, I want you to think that I'm good at working at on a house. Although Rob Blaney told me today, he's like, that's a little too shiny. And I do want to say this is my second tape measure in my life. This is not my first. I bought a new one last year because it stopped working. But nonetheless, I am personally offended, and I will carry that with me for the rest of my days. But I want you to imagine that in this parable, you have this guy, in this case, Jesus, and he's handing out possessions or talents. But now let's imagine that instead of doing that, he's divvying up his property, which is applicable as well. And you can apply the principle in that way. And he gets out his big tape measure, and he starts measuring out his property. And he says to one, he's like, I'm going to give you over here, I'm going to give you 10 acres. Or maybe I'm going to give you something like 50,000 square feet, which is about like half the size of a city block in Manhattan. And then he stretches it out again and gives it a little less to somebody over here. And he says, I'm going to give this servant 20,000 square feet, which is like, in light of the Super Bowl, it's like a third of a football field from the end zone to the 30-yard line. And then another one over here to Bellevue Christian, he gives out this much over here, 10,000 square feet or something like that, which is the size of a couple of housing lots in a neighborhood like Bellevue. And so imagine instead of just handing out possessions, he's divvying up his property to these different churches in a sense, where he's giving out, this church has this much, this church has this much for whatever reason. But in light of that, the question our leadership council believes that we're being invited to pray in this season is something like this, is, Lord, what do you want us to do with every square inch that you've entrusted to us as a church, as an urban church right here on the corner of these two streets that's been here for a long time? God, what do you want us to do with the square inches that you have divvied up to us? Not, we wish we had more, or why don't we have as much as this church over here, but what are you going us to do with what we have been given? And we're going to come back to the rest of that story, that parable, in a bit. But that's the question that we want to be praying about this year. And it's a question, if I wanted to, I could preach a whole sermon on how we could pray this question over our own property, like whether you rent your property or whether you own it. You can also be praying, God, how do you want to use the space that you've been given, or that's been given to me? And I encourage you to do that this year. But it's a question that we want to think deeply about together as a whole church, as if this story is not just about one servant, but about churches, and not just about money, but about also a piece of property. And so we're inviting you in these next couple of years as a church to start thinking about how does God want to use every square inch? And that's our church's vision that you're going to hear until you're sick of it for years. And that's okay with us, because it's a good phrase to remember, because it reminds us that Jesus is Lord over everything. But we're going to be applying it very literally to how we think about square inches in our church, as we're inviting ordinary people to live everyday life like Jesus for the good of the neighborhood. And we've been thinking about this for a number of years. A couple of years ago, back in 2024, our leadership council took a retreat, and we spent some time discerning, God, where are you leading us in the next 3 to 5 years? And this is one of the things that came up, was thinking about our building. But we had other things we wanted to focus on first, from leadership development, some stuff we wanted to do with discipleship, being for the good of the neighborhood. But now, not just with those things out of the way, but with those things moving, we feel like now is the time to begin to move on this. And you might be wondering, why now, though? In addition to sensing God's leading, let me just tell you a couple other factors. The first is just contextual, and it has to do with our neighborhood. If you were to go stand on our porch after church today and look out, and if you look left from our front porch, you'll notice a brand new grocery store is being built, which is pretty unheard of in a place like Bellevue, or just in an urban place in general. Typically, you're going to build those further out. But the fact that they're building that and making a significant financial investment in our neighborhood right now is important, and we're noticing that. Or if you stand on the porch and you look to the right, you'll notice there used to be a funeral home over there that has been demolished. And they're going to be building for a different purpose, a state-of-the-art building right there. And so what we're noticing is that people are making significant investment right here in this neighborhood in this season. And we're wondering if maybe now is the time to make a significant investment in our building as well. Another piece, though, that I want to spend more time focusing on is a trend that we've noticed when you look through the history of our church. I've often heard that your destiny is in your history, which can be both a negative and a positive thing. In this case, it's a positive thing. But when you look through the 130-year history of our church, fascinating trend, it feels like every 60 to 65 years, there's a generation that comes along in our church and invests significantly in setting up our building and property for decades to come. Let me just walk you through just a little bit of it. I love a good timeline, so we're going to put one up there. But I shared a little bit of this 5 years ago on our 125th anniversary as part of a series called Churches That Last. But our church started here in Bellevue in 1896. At that time, Bellevue was what's called a streetcar community, and so we were streetcar accessible from downtown, which meant a lot of people started moving here because they could still work downtown. And so, including a lot of Christians, and they're like, we want a church here. And so they started a church. They didn't have a building. They started meeting on a second floor down the street. They were a church plant in 1896 on a second floor right on Lincoln Avenue. And then in 1899, they're like, we need a building. So they built this building right here on this corner. Back then in 1899, this is what it originally looked like. So these doors right over here, that's where the bell tower is. That was the front entrance of the church in 1899. These pews are not original, but this space here was from 1899. That space over there is from 1899 as well. So if you're sitting in any of these spaces, you have that generation of Christians to thank for it. Move ahead to 1960 to 1961, 62 years later. If you walk outside of our church and notice on your way out today, there's a cornerstone at the front corner over there by the corner where the two streets come together. And it says 1961, which is not the year that our church was built, as I just said, but it's the year our church was expanded. And in 1961, our church discerned it was time to extend the building to make more room for making disciples, from kids to adults. And that was under the leadership of Pastor Milton Johnstone. A minute ago, there were some elders standing here, the tallest of which was Graham. And Graham, here's Graham right here. That was Milton Johnstone, was actually Graham's grandfather, who helped lead the charge back in the 60s to help make that happen. We have a letter from him that was written at that time. It's on our website at bellevuechristian.church/every-square-inch that Ed Hain, our property leader, just uncovered. And they called the vision at that time, Together We Build for Christ, which I thought was better than Every Square Inch. So I almost ripped that when we found it, but we decided to just keep Every Square Inch. But at that time, they added the back of the sanctuary. They added the front lobby. They renovated and did the whole downstairs. Here's one picture from when they were doing construction on that end of the church. And so where that wall comes down in the middle and the lower ceiling back there, all that was added then. So if you're sitting in the back rows, you have them to thank for that. There's room for you in our church because they had vision then. Let's skip ahead now to 2026, and there's been a lot that's happened in between as well. But we're now about 65 years later, and there's been significant investment in our church over the past 20 years as well, especially under my dad's leadership. Lots of improvements to the look of our church. The stage was expanded under that. This carpet was added. The downstairs, there's a lot of work that was done then as well, including also the purchase of the property next door, which we'll talk more about in phase 2, probably about a year from now. But nonetheless, a lot was done then. But now we're beginning to wonder, is now the time? Is it providentially time within our history to think about this again? A third factor is our church is growing. You might not realize this because you probably go to the same service every week, but both services are growing from kids to adults. 2 years ago, in January, on the first Sunday in January, our attendance was like 115 or something like that. Last year, on the first Sunday in January, the average in January was 147. This year, on the first Sunday in January, it was like 180 to 186 or something like that, just in 2 years. And the reason for that is because you guys keep inviting people, and we want that to happen. We want to make room for people to explore who Jesus is and start a relationship with him. But one thing about it is we don't plan to move our church anywhere. We actually feel like this church is supposed to be right here in this neighborhood. And so we want to keep ministering here for as long as possible, and that means we have to use every square inch of this space. And then if we had any doubts, if we're like, man, I don't know, maybe now's not the year. Our basement got flooded in November, and now we have no choice because the lower level where we do kids ministry got flooded, and now we have no choice but to say it's time. Let's do this. So if we needed a nudge, and maybe the Lord knew we can be risk adverse, it was time to go for it and make it happen. And so with those factors in God's leading, we believe that 2026 is the year to start a multi-year, multi-phase, once-in-a-generation investment in our building and property called Every Square Inch. And so that we can invite ordinary people to live everyday life like Jesus for the good of the neighborhood for decades to come, starting with phase 1 this year. And you might have noticed I've used the word phase 1 a lot. This year is really just about phase 1, but there are future years where we're beginning to think about the rest of our property as well, and that's what phase 2 will be about down the road. What we really believe is we need to be faithful with this building first and figure out how does God want to use every square inch of this before we use the rest of the square inches that he's given to us. And we believe we will be positioned to be faithful with more. So that said, let me give you phase one in a nutshell, because I know all of you came looking for a blueprint today, and I want to show you. No, you weren't, but nonetheless, here is one. Phase one is about optimizing the lower level of our building to be a safe and secure disciple-making environment for our kids, and updating the bathrooms for the rest of us. Can I get an amen? Amen. That's right. And so lots of conversations over the past few months have been had around this. Our leadership council finalized a floor plan on Tuesday that's going to look pretty close to this, assuming we don't run into some things as we're beginning to tear down a couple of walls. But this was developed primarily by our phase one leadership team of Ed Hain, Talia Ames, and Julie Gone, who have logged countless hours having conversations with lots of different people, different stakeholders, including parents, teachers, leaders. It's gone through multiple drafts, multiple iterations. We did a walkthrough with fake walls and tape just to see what it would be like as parents to check in their kids through this. And so I want to just take a moment to walk you through this. And then at the end of service, Talia and Ed and Julie will all be available in the back of the sanctuary to answer any questions, and there's some handouts of this where you can go deeper as well. So first thing is down there in the left corner, we're updating the bathrooms, which is the only thing we're really doing for the adults. So there you go. But that's going to be, it's great. It's a good move. We're also shrinking down the kitchen. And so our kitchen was normally, it's that yellow one up there, but it was expanded over to the left. We're going to shrink that down. We're also going to get rid of an office down there because we think more importantly in this season is making space for an additional classroom for 4th and 5th graders so that they can call their own and that we don't have to compromise on making a great space for them. We're also creating a large expanded parents lobby where parents can easily find classrooms and where they can linger and talk. Right now, our parents lobby is that tiny little thing labeled entry, and there's a traffic jam almost every week. But now it's going to be that whole orange section in the middle, creating a space for parents that if you're a new parent, you walk in, and it's like a hub and spokes where all of the classrooms are easily connected and easy to find. But also if you're a parent and you get there and you look at the sermon topic and you're like, not for me, and you just want to linger and talk to other parents, you can do that. There's a space for you to do that in our church. And then we're also creating access, and this might feel like a small thing, but we're creating access for all of our kids to a kids' restroom that's just for them so that we can make sure that's a safe and secure environment all the way through Sunday morning for them. But just as one more example of how we're trying to use every square inch of this building to fulfill our mission, let me just tell you about the storage room for a moment. This is our storage closet at its worst. A couple of years ago, all kinds of things in there, a lot of fun adventure in there. There was everything you need to make slime if you need it. On purpose, it was in there. There is also heavy brown tables that we haven't used in a decade. If you're familiar with the TV show Friends, it's our version of Monica's secret closet. We're like, don't go in there. And Talia just lovingly calls it the dungeon for whatever reason. So there's that. And that's typically been a storage room for us to store all kinds of things. But as we were thinking about ways to optimize the lower level of our church for kids ministry, we just kept thinking, like, could this be a classroom? Like, it's the right size when you get rid of everything out of there. It's the right size for a certain age grouping that would allow us to put all those classrooms down there. And so we were thinking about this, and here's what's interesting is that Ed Hain, our property leader, was looking through original blueprints from the 1960s when they built and renovated the downstairs and built the addition. And look at how it's labeled. This right here in the middle is actually that storage room, and it's labeled as classroom. The original vision for that space was to be a classroom. But like most spaces in our lives, it becomes storage for all of our stuff. But we're wondering, is now the time to redeem that space and use it for something different? Because there's all kinds of places you can store stuff, like the dumpster. You would be amazed. You'd be amazed. But there's all kinds of places. We can find other places to store things. We don't have a lot of other spaces for classrooms. And so this is a great opportunity for us to redeem that space. And it's just one way that we're thinking very creatively about reclaiming every square inch of this building. And so we see ourselves in this season like the servant who's been entrusted with talents. We're a church that's been entrusted with building and property since 1896, but really 1899. And so the question that we're asking in this season, the question that we're inviting you to pray with us, is a question that's been asked in many seasons before as well, which is, Lord, what do you want to do? What do you want to do with every square inch of the property that you've entrusted to us? How do you want us to set up this space for decades and generations to come, to be a place that makes disciples for the good of the neighborhood, from kids all the way to adults. And we're inviting you into that with us. In 2026, there's two different ways that we're inviting you to participate in every square inch. We're going to have an opportunity for you to do both of them today. First thing is to pray for every square inch. We want to invite God into every part of phase 1 of every square inch over the coming year. We believe that this is destined to fail if God is not a part of it and if it's not from him. And so we know that there's a real enemy who wants to do anything he can to disrupt stuff like this. And so we've already been praying together as a leadership council. Our leadership community as a whole, which is our council, our staff, and our volunteer leaders, met up earlier this month, and we spent time just praying in the basement together. And so pray for this space. It's one way that you can redeem your time, as we talked about a few weeks ago. A couple of things you can be praying for, even starting today. You can pray for provision, that God would provide expanded generosity of $130,000 be above our operating budget to do this. Pray for unity, that we would become even more unified as a church throughout this project. You can pray for future generations, that God would use the work that we begin this year and in the coming years to bless generations to come. Even if you don't have kids that are going to use this space, praying that your investment is going to make a difference in their lives, the kids that do use this space. Pray for the project itself. People like Ed Hain, who are leading the construction side, or Julie, who's leading the design side, or Talia, who's leading the logistics of kids ministry and what that looks like, and the right people in our church to come alongside to help, the right subcontractors, the right timeline, all that goes into a project. Be praying for that. And I know for me, it's hard to remember to pray for things like this. I've got a lot on my mind, but it's hard maybe to remember what to be praying for the church. So we want to help you. And so 2 things. One is our church loves stickers. And so we got a sticker for you. You can grab a sticker on your way out today and put it somewhere. I put mine on my computer, but somewhere where you remember to see this and to pray for this this year. And so the other thing, though, is we want you to take one of our old church dishes. This is one of those. I would not recommend eating off of it. But we want you to take it for 2 reasons. One is it's a good physical reminder to pray. And so we want you to take this. We want you to put it on your table or somewhere where you're going to see it this year. You can even put your sticker on it. It's a reminder that we are part of a long legacy as a church, that there have been people who have been eating off this table for years. I was just talking to someone before service who remembers using these plates. We used to use them at weddings, set them up for all kinds of things. We have used these plates for years. And so you take one of these, put it somewhere where you'll see it often as a reminder to pray. Second reason, though, is by taking one of these dishes, you are literally participating in every square inch by freeing up square inches that these dishes are taking up in our church right now. Part of the reason why we can't use that storage room is because there's a storage room inside of the storage room, and that storage room is full of these plates. And so by taking these off of our hands and into your lives, please don't ever bring it back. We don't care what happens to it after it enters into your life. But we want to give them to you as a reminder to pray, but also by taking one today, you've freed up a square inch that we can use for what we want to use it for the next generation. And so in the coming weeks, we're going to put out more dishes. If you're like, I'd love a whole set, we can make that happen for you. And so we want you to be praying for this. And this is just a reminder to pray, and that there was a generation that bought these plates at one point as an investment in what our church was doing at that time. And now today we can use these as a reminder to be the generation in our time to invest in our church again. And so in Lent, we're going to be opening up our church again on Wednesdays from 4:30 to 5:30 to pray. You can pray for whatever you want, but that's just something that you can be praying for in that season as well. The second way to be a part of this is to pledge to expand your generosity for every square inch. As we shared a few weeks ago, we're asking God for $130,000 above our normal operating budget for this year to help fund phase 1 of every square inch. And that number, 130K, was not just pulled out of thin air. This is the 130th anniversary of our church, and that will get us in the ballpark of what renovations will cost. We have savings as well that we're going to use to make up the difference, but it's one way that you can use every dollar to help make a difference this year as well. And so as we shared a little bit ago, our budget for this year was affirmed unanimously, which means that there's a belief in this church that this is the right budget for this season and that we're going to provide for it together. And so $396,000 of our budget will go toward our normal operating budget in a year, and then the other $130,000 will go toward every square inch. Total generosity this year is $526,000. And so 2 weeks ago, we asked you to begin to pray about this. We encourage you to take a pledge card, not 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, and begin praying about what you might want to pledge and expand a generosity this year and leave a generational legacy. And if you didn't get one, there's more available up here and in the back as well. But just a reminder of how it works. On these cards, there's space to write what you normally give in a year. And if you gave to our church last year, you should have just got a giving receipt this past month. That tells you exactly what that was. And then the second line is to talk about how do you want to expand your generosity? If everybody gives what they gave last year, we will meet our operating budget. But it's that second line that will help us expand our generosity and expand what we can do as a church in the next year. And so even if you didn't give anything last year, you can just write what you want to give this year in line 2, and you've expanded your generosity. And there's no separate fund for every square inch, but by giving to our church, you're giving to both our operating budget and this vision. So no drop down, nothing needed in the memo. That's how you give toward that. And so once you discern what you want to give, you can set up and adjust your giving by going to bellevuechristian.church/giving. You can send in checks, cash, all of that is all how you can help fund our budget for this year and help make this happen. And so we're going to have a lot more ways to get involved throughout phase 1 as Ed, our project leader for this, continues to discover which parts of the project we're going to do ourselves and which part we're going to subcontract out. If you have skills in the area of this, we would love to know about that, and Ed would love to know about that, and we will put you to good use as well. And so in a moment, after communion, we're going to give you a chance to pray about this with us. But then we'll also give you a chance to make a pledge if you're ready this week for how you want to expand your generosity as part of every square inch. We had a bunch of people do that last service as well. And we have 3 drop boxes around the room, one here, and one in the back. And during our worship response set today, it's an opportunity for you to drop that off. And so when we invite you in a little bit after communion, you can go up to one of those drop boxes on your own, with friends, with your family, as a couple, and just take a moment. And you can pray over the vision for this year. And you might be thinking, like, I can't expand my generosity this year. We get that. We're not pressuring you. We're just inviting you in. And we know that this is the number that God has given us for this season, and so we trust that he's going to provide for us. And so when you give anything to our church this year, you're helping fund this in the long run. And so we want everybody, though, to take a dish and a sticker on their way out to remember to pray for this as well. And so the other thing, though, is you might be thinking, like, I want to make a pledge. I just totally forgot to think about it. Things came up. I didn't think about it this month. That's okay. We're going to have these boxes available for the next few weeks as well. And this pledge is really just a way for you just to make a moment of commitment, thinking about how do you want to be a part of this. So we'll have those available for the next 2 weeks. But as we close, I want to bring it back to Matthew 25 for a moment. And again, we want to imagine for a moment that it's about 3 churches that have been entrusted with a building or property, and imagine that we are one of those churches, and we're standing before the Lord all together as a church. We've got our Bellevue Christian, t-shirts on. We've got our For the Good totes. We're like, we're ready, Jesus. What are you giving to us? And he's like, I've given you this. And when Jesus returns from his long journey, we are going to hear one of 2 things as a church. And by the way, it's not crazy for God to speak directly to churches. If you read the book of Revelation, there's 7 letters written to whole churches from Jesus. And the question is, what will he want to say to this church right here in Bellevue? And in light of this text, there's at least 2 things that he might say. One is, you evil, lazy servant, which is not what I think we want to hear. But if we never take a risk as a church, if we just bury what we've been entrusted with in the ground, Jesus says this is what we're going to hear. Jesus says that even what that servant has will be taken away and given to another. And let me tell you something. If you look throughout the history of the church in this city, you will find many times where churches stopped making disciples at some point, and eventually their churches were handed to another. The keys were given away. The church was sold to something that's either going to use it as a restaurant or as a music venue or maybe as a church, but it's been given to another. And honestly, here's the thing. I'm just like the evil, lazy servant in this. I'm afraid of taking a risk. I'm the kind of person who would bury something in the ground. And I don't know about building projects a lot, but I've got people in my life who do. Fundraising scares me, but I've had people in my life who have given me wisdom about that. But we are, as a church, I have talked to so many of you, and we are full of people from our council to our staff and leaders to people in our church who aren't afraid to take a risk, who are excited to see what God is going to do in this generation of our church to bless future generations. You're excited and you're thinking about the day when maybe as a church we might hear option 2, which is well done, good and faithful servant. That's what I want us to hear as a church in this generation, a church that wasn't afraid to invest in and use every square inch of what we have been given right here on this corner to make disciples, starting with this building in 2026. And then in the future years, thinking beyond it as well. If we're faithful with what we have, I believe we're positioned to be faithful with more. we're not always going to get this right as a church. And I'm sure if you look throughout the 130-year history of our church, you're going to find moments where we got this wrong. That's why we still need good news. And the good news is this, is that Jesus gave his life for the church, not just for that church or this church over here, not for our church building, but he gave his life for the church, the people, you and me, what's called his bride in Ephesians chapter 5. He laid down his life so that we could be his. Jesus was the one who was cast into outer darkness, not unlike what happens to the servant, so that through faith in him, we could be part of his kingdom. We could be his people. We could be his church. We could be trusted as servants with every square inch. That's where it starts, with the fact that we've been invited to be a servant in the first place, to have a seat at the table with him, and look forward to the day when he returns and we get to enter fully into our master's joy. And so in a little bit, we'll have an opportunity for you to pray and maybe drop off a pledge. And if you need a moment to do that, there's extras in the back. There's extras in the pew in front of you as well. And it's okay if you need a couple of weeks. We want you to think about that if you haven't had a chance yet. And so Justin's going to lead us into communion to remind us of the gospel. And then we're going to take some time to respond in worship and in prayer and in a variety of different ways.